So welcome everyone here to this Whiteshield briefing session on ChatGPT, a new reality for policymaking. We've seen a lot of technological evolutions, especially actually in the last few months. And here we're going to be considering exactly what can be the impact specifically on governments and on public policy. Let's kick this off. So we have an agenda as follows. We're going to do a brief demo of ChatGPT to demonstrate its capabilities in an area of public policy, actually. So you really see it live in action. Then we'll turn to consider the market itself of large language models, which is the market for the likes of ChatGPT, a case study on the disruptions of labor markets specifically, and then consider a few directions for government. Those are the four topics that we're looking to address in our time together. So let's start with the beginning with the ChatGPT demo. And here we have a context here for this demonstration. So we have a question, which is how can civil servants use ChatGPT to streamline the policy process? So imagine you're a civil servant and you want to move forward on your particular task. So there are four blocks here. We see a first, so this is a context where we're assuming you're in a UN context. So 14th United Nations Congress on crime prevention and criminal justice, and preparations for the 15th United Nations Congress on crime prevention and criminal justice, okay? So this is a typical sort of public policy situation. In the first case, you're looking to summarize a conference. So you imagine the civil servant has to summarize, is going to use ChatGPT to summarize the conference. Second, a benchmark of countries on what they're doing to tackle the topic. So what are policies from other countries? Third, an analysis, an arbitrary analysis using dummy data with the support of ChatGPT. And fourth, actually drafting a policy to respond to this issue. So there's actually a drafting of policy. So let's go through it. Chavez, please.
Thank you, Anthony. If we can please proceed. So here, as Anthony mentioned, that we'll be going over to summarize a UN meeting document, and finding the second step would be defining global benchmarks, policy solutions implemented in different countries to tackle the issue. The third would be to analyze some specific data, and fourth would be to develop a baseline policy draft. If we can proceed. So this is how the platform looks like. And as you can see, I've instructed ChatGPT over here to summarize the document and key takeaways. In a while, what you'll see is that I'll be copying the draft resolution, the policy, the UN meeting, and putting it to ChatGPT to get the summary and the takeaways automatically, rather than going through the entire document on my own. So once the copying is complete, you'll see ChatGPT in its full visual capacity. See, now it can draft the key points of the meeting instantly, as well as the takeaways. For the second one, we'll be looking at finding the benchmarks for potential policy solutions, which countries have implemented to address the crime prevention that was discussed in the UN meeting document. If we can please proceed. So what you'll see here is that, again, I have instructed ChatGPT to find these global benchmarks, but I want this to be in a table format in which the first column would be the country of implementation, the policy implemented, the year of implementation, and the impact. So it also has the capacity and the capability to give the information in a format that I require it to give. Thirdly, I will ask ChatGPT to write some Excel formulas for me, which I will use them to analyze a data set that I personally have as a civil servant on crime prevention. If we can again, please proceed to the demo. So what I'm telling in this prompt is that I'm telling them about the respective columns in which the data that I have, and I've asked this to compute the average age of fertility victims for males and females, given the data in the columns that I have. As you can see, ChatGPT is now drafting a formula, which I just take it exactly as it is and put it in my Excel And you see it starts giving out the results without any alteration in an effortless manner. And lastly, for the conclusive task, I will ask ChatGPT to develop a baseline policy draft for me for the crime prevention. Now, at this stage, it's very important to understand that ChatGPT is now acting as an agent who has a memory of one, the document that we summarized, two, the benchmarks that it found, and three, the data that it analyzed. So if we can again, please proceed to the demo. In this prompt, I'm asking it to draft a policy document for an arbitrary country, but the context is that it should be in a legal tone with an official title and while using all its memory and the information that it has. So as you see, it drafts a title, it drafts a preamble, and then it starts drafting the chapters with the objectives, definition, strategic approach, and so on and so forth. So with this, as you saw, that ChatGPT can do all of the 4 tasks brilliantly and has the potential to do much, much more. I give it the floor back to you, Anthony.
Thank you, Shavez. So that when we were doing this demo, that was the part that impressed me the most, is this part 4 when they start to draft the policy memo. So you see, we're moving from a kind of situation where a civil servant would be reading an entire document and spending time to summarize to having this automatic summary of points in a matter of minutes. You go from a time when you would do days of research, of benchmarking of different countries and what they've done in the area of crime prevention to automatic summary of different benchmarks, even in a table, formatted in a table. That you would be doing data analysis where ChatGPT is actually suggesting the different formulas and you input it into Excel and you have the Excel which comes out and with the data, and even a proposal for a possible draft, let's say legislation or policy, which is summarized, you saw 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 under a format that would be 80% there from a civil service perspective. So there we go. That's the kind of kickoff situation. So from that, let's now move to the wider market, the bigger picture on large language models. So the LLM is the name that's given to this sector now. We call it the large language models, which are interactive ways of using AI. So first point here in this market is you see the short time it's taking for this to rise exponentially. We're talking of something which was developed pretty much end of 2018, ChatGPT 1. It had 117 million parameters. And already within 2 years, it goes from 117 to 1 trillion parameters. The parameters are all the things it's pulling from the web in order to converse in a more and more sophisticated manner. And it's involved in general knowledge and problem-solving abilities. This is ChatGPT 4. And of course, it has much wider ambitions, which is to execute any intellectual task that a human can do. Now, we can debate whether that's possible or not. We can see that within 8 weeks of ChatGPT being launched, suddenly we have Google that launches its competitor, which is Bard. And from the China perspective, you have Baidu, which launches a Chinese competitor, which is named Ernie. So this has also just generated a whole series of competition in this sector, which is even further accelerating the development of this type of AI. Continue. Now, if you look at the history behind the time to reach 100 million users, and you look at the previous cases where you had Google, Uber, Telegram, etc., we see that ChatGPT has just exploded the time frame here to reach 1 million users. 2 days. 2 days of being online, and it was already in there with 100 million users. Sorry, 100 million users, 1 million users in 5 days. And 100 million users in two months. So just explosive here in the speed with which you have take up with this open AI. Now, there's not only ChatGPT, there's a whole series of other applications there which have been very rapidly developing and growing. And you see it involves text to video, text to text, text to 3D, text to code. You have more than 300 different of these applications, and is continuing to grow in all forms and shapes. So this is really developing rapidly, not only with a few pillars, but also with a series of other different applications. And an interesting point here is if you continue, if you look at this piece of art, I don't know if anybody would have a suggestion as to who is the artist behind it, but it's actually a video game designer, Jason Allen. He worked 80 hours in providing instructions here to an application called Midjourney, which is using this type of ChatGPT technology. And this is to create actually art from scratch. So this is an original piece of art that won Colorado State art competition. And you can imagine that the artists were not very happy with this happening. And so we're looking at artistic capabilities also under threat here, okay? This is the context of this sector that we're looking at. So there's a whole question about, you know, the different kind of new tasks that are being automated. And I think a key message here to start off is that previously AI was a threat to repetitive or mundane tasks. And now more and more we're looking at tasks which are of a level which is much higher. So there's much higher skill, and that's on the right, where we see, you know, publishing, writing. So writers are high risk, investment, insurance, data processors, and programmers. You have whole programming which can be done using these types of technologies. So a big question here is, you know, what does this mean in terms of obviously the future of work and the future of specific work, especially also in the public service. So maybe I'll turn to Tom here, who will do a case study on the labor market.
Thanks, Anthony. So we'll look at what this actually means for obviously, you know, a critical portion of our economy, of our societies, in essence, labor. And we know previously, and what we'll call the first paradigm, is that there has been automation. You know, as Anthony mentioned, a lot of this has been focused much more in terms of routine tasks, assembly line work, data entry, customer service. And we're looking primarily at, you know, blue collar, low skilled occupations when we talk in terms of which jobs or occupations are actually being lost due to this automation and this phenomenon. What we're seeing now, though, with the rise of these large language models, these foundational models, ChatGPT, is that they're targeting or impacting different sets of tasks. Often those tasks that involve complex decision-making. You know, we look at financial analyses, it could be medical diagnosis, it could be legal research, it could actually be more knowledge, you know, types of jobs, and even knowledge types of tasks. So even as Chavez so aptly demonstrated us, you know, in the beginning, impacting more of the white collar and high skilled occupations. But within the shift in terms of, you know, paradigm and this change of what's called automation plus, we've got two critical questions. So first, what sectors and occupations are the most exposed? And that's an important word, as in exposed, because even if your job occupation is exposed to AI, does that actually mean that your job is going to be substituted away, meaning your job is not going to be it anymore? Or is it fundamentally going to be transformed? This is the fundamental question, at least for the labor market itself, and how we as policymakers should think about ChatGPT and these associated technologies. So if we go to the next one, please, Avery. When we look at that question, we look at it through these channels. And this is quite useful for us to think in terms of where the impact is on occupations. We have AI applications. So in essence, when we talk about AI or this automation, typically we look at where is it actually being applied? Strategy games, real-time video games, image recognition, you know, so on and so forth. These are done by different types of, you know, institutions or entities. One popular one is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We look at the abilities. So which are actually those abilities? It could be tasks, it could be skills, you know, as defined. Oral comprehension, oral expression, inductive reasoning, arm hand steadiness, whole host down the line, both in terms of the cognitive skills and let's say the physical skills. And then the mapping to the occupations themselves. It could be telemarketers, it could be, you know, policy consultants, it could be financial analysts, what have you. You link the applications to the abilities to then ultimately to the occupations. And fundamentally at that very base is we need to assess, is something like language modeling, speech recognition, instrumental tracking going to, if ChatGPT, AI, automation, et cetera, automates those explicit things? Will they automate or develop within there? Will that then lead to an automation of those explicit abilities or skills, oral comprehension, induction, etc.? Then will that actually then lead to that linkage with the occupations themselves? So that's where we get to say telemarketers out of the, for example, 32 different abilities that constitute a telemarketer, 16 of those abilities have exposure to AI and have the potential to basically be automated. This is where all these fundamentally what we're looking at the analysis of what's the impact of occupations. These are the fundamental building blocks of it. When we look at the results, we can see that there's a ChatGPT impact explicitly. And this is actually looking at the language modeling portion of the application itself, as opposed to some of these other pieces. Why? Because of the cognitive and the complexity in terms of that piece. So we know that it actually affects these channels in a slightly different way than when we looked previously at the automation. Now, what does this actually mean in terms of the impacts in terms of sectors and then occupations in terms of exposure? So if we could go to the next one, please. We know that in our paradigm one, in terms of the automation, when we looked at sectors, it was things in terms of, financial, securities, commodity, financial investments, accounting, insurance, legal services, brokerage. Occupations, more generic counselors, examiners, actuaries, procurement clerks, budget analysis. When we add on that additional paradigm of looking at what maybe these large language models do, we see a slight shift, both in terms of sectors. So we see legal services, for example, at the top, but some similar ones, securities, credit intermediation, et cetera. But we see a slightly different look at the potential occupations impacted. So the telemarketers, for example, teachers. One paper which is actually looking at this in terms of language modelers impacting the occupations and industries, actually looked at the educational sector as one of the critical pieces. And something like 10 out of the top 20 occupations would be different types of teachers. Judges, magistrates, clinical professionals, and psychologists, for example, as being more exposed, to such large language models, if you will. So we have a bit of a shift in terms of the expectations of sectors and occupations. Now, there's the question about this, as in, will these occupations be substituted or will they ultimately be transformed? And only by looking at the different types of tasks, that doesn't actually lead to those types of questions. If you take the reverse, which are actually the bottom occupations, for example, least exposed to AI, then you get things like bricklayer, for example, builder, so on and so forth. Things where, obviously employment and stability within those sectors, maybe not necessarily something that most policymakers would be targeted. The other critical piece is that this doesn't actually analyze or assess which new occupations will actually arise. We know that different occupations come up with each different types of technological waves. So, for example, the Bureau of Labor Statistics within the United States, for example, 5 years or maybe 7 or 8 years ago, for example, didn't have, solar engineer, for example, solar panel engineer, included within its classifications. But now it's there, for example. Why? Because of the rise of the particular energy. So we also know that not only will the occupations itself, uncertain in terms of substitution transformation, but we'll actually get new types of occupations as well. The final piece is that we need to actually look at the occupations themselves and actually at the tasks by the occupation. So we even see from the beginning that, for example, teachers, if we take a look at the mapping in terms of the LLM, ChatGPT, in terms of the tasks themselves, would be highly exposed. That doesn't necessarily mean that they'll go away. We know that some of those tasks could be complemented. For example, we can get more extensive feedback, more diversified teaching materials that teachers would have access to. Maybe they'll allow for new tasks to be done in terms of students-specific presentations, individual learning class. Why? Because they can use different language models to actually customize it. Tailored exercises for students. We know certain tasks may be automated. Maybe it'll be easier for them to share teaching material, update the content of their class presentation. And we know that maybe some of those tasks which may be less value added for teachers, in some sense or not, may go away, if you will. Maybe instead of delivering a specific course in terms of, with 25 different types of students, maybe it's a large type of lecture and then individual, teaching as well. So looking at these in terms of this types of parameters, we know that it's not just the exposure to AI, but then it's intermingled with the cost effectiveness, demand for services. Do we as society really want, teachers to go away and us to learn from different types of AI automation systems? It's a question. And policy as well. Policy can actually protect different types of jobs, for better or worse as well, depending on, the government's view in terms of society. So this provides at least a little bit in terms of, labor implications on labor policy, how we actually look at, some of these occupational developments, and critically this idea about exposure of these occupations to models like ChatGPT and large language models. With that, Anthony, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Tom. So definitely here insightful in this notion of looking at exposure. And so we shouldn't simplify and think in terms of jobs won or jobs lost, but it's really the tasks that you have within a job which are shifting and changing, and that we have to see, this has implications in terms of training, upskilling. It has implications in terms of new types of employment, and we just have to find the right balance between what are the skills needed and making sure people are trained with them in their occupations. So let's move on now to a last section on the considerations for government. So first of all, the big picture is, government civil service, we see it as you're impacted internally and externally. So internally, we saw there's a whole series of opportunities for productivity enhancements. That's the ChatGPT demo that you saw, for new content generation, for analysis and research, for coding support. There's a whole series of tasks here which are going to be are accelerated potentially today. If all the civil servants were trained to optimize the use of ChatGPT, you can imagine the impact on productivity here, right? So that's one, internal impact. And then the external impact is there's a whole series of benefits here, right? In terms of enhanced communication, in terms of working with different segments of the population. ChatGPT can be used to reach out to different archetypes of citizens in a very interactive and effective manner. It can be used for better forecasting of trends and scenarios, and overall kind of enhanced services offering in terms of providing a response to people who have questions on how government can support them and what are the services that are provided. So we also need to look at this optimistic dimension in terms of the richer palette of services that are offered from government, and a better way to connect with citizens, also coming from on the external perspective. Now, another external dimension here, which is of course is policy and to protect and to support the workers' employment. So the whole implications from Tom's section here, we would add also to this external aspect, which is consideration of new forms of policy, and we'll address that at the end. So then if we move on, and this is, let's say, a simplified view today of how different countries would be looking at and considering something like these LLM models. You can consider two dimensions here. One, which is the market restrictiveness here. This is the high-low that you see there. And the other is the government approach on the horizontal, the reactive versus proactive. And so the market restrictiveness basically means, you have ChatGPT coming in. Do you try and block it, like many countries have considered to do, and some have, or do you leave it open? And then the reactive and proactive is essentially, are you looking to stay ahead of the game and work to get the most out of ChatGPT, or are you just knee-jerk reacting to regulations to stop it in particular sectors or protect certain worker positions? And so that's the kind of first framework we'll be looking at, and we see that again, this is a few countries here, but you see that a country like the UAE has been actually quite proactive in its approach, has kept this AI open, but is also looking at launching guides on how to use generative AI in the most effective way possible, including as a strategic tool for government entities. So it's quite interesting to have government which is thinking already now, how does the job description change for the civil servant right now, and perhaps anticipate rapid training now today on this, and also even the legislation behind the civil servants a job profile, because you can't just change job profiles overnight, as we know, in the civil servants. So there's a whole series of implications in terms of legality here, and you want to be proactive. You don't want to be reactive in the sense that you wait for 2 years and suddenly there's a huge crisis that has to be developed on the labor force side. And then on another dimension here, there's a whole debate on the level of restrictiveness you would have. I think the overall message that we would have on restrictiveness is it's going to be impossible to restrict these. Just if you look at the numbers that we presented at the beginning, the genie is out. Okay, something, by the way, that we did not mention in the sector is this is not only proprietary AIs. Now, since March 2023, the kind of open source generative models have also been developed. There's one that was developed that was leaked out from the Meta group of Facebook, an open source ChatGPT, which was improved by programmers around the world in a few weeks. And in a few weeks, it was close to the original ChatGPT 1, and that's open source software. So that's great in the sense that means it's not going to be a technology restricted to just a few firms, because it costs like 30 to 50 million US dollars today to set up something like that on a proprietary level. The open source software means that the genie is out of the bottle, and a lot of different actors are going to have access to this technology. So not probably a good idea to focus efforts on trying to stop this. On the other hand, regulate it is another story, and we'll talk about this. So if we turn to the next picture, the last one, if we think about government response here, you can look at it along these lines. And again, this is up for discussion and debate. We can have questions about this. We see it as one, there's a whole element of capabilities building, right? There's clearly a need to build new capabilities in how to use ChatGPT, but also how to have more enhanced capabilities within jobs that are being impacted by ChatGPT. There's a whole governance framework that needs to be put in place here in terms of what are the acceptable risks associated with AI, what is not acceptable, what are some areas which are not allowed. I think Chavez earlier on was saying before this session that something like how to print a gun on 3D we're using 3D manufacturing is currently not allowed by ChatGPT, and you need to have a kind of broader governance framework for this for all other competitors to ChatGPT. There needs to be a checks and balances process here, definitely, in terms of making sure that there are not major mistakes that go through something like ChatGPT, which could lead to major errors, and so there's a whole kind of controlling and monitoring mechanism that needs to be incorporated. There's the whole dimension of privacy and security impacts, of course, confidentiality, security obligations, etc. We saw the case of Samsung, in which some employees of Samsung actually put some of their code onto ChatGPT, and then it went and was spread across the world. So huge security breach potential here. And then finally, there's a whole dimension here of policy response. What are the kind of the policy parameters that we want to put in place, guidelines which monitor and restrict what ChatGPT type products are allowed to do or not allowed to do. And this is where we see definitely a big government role, and it has to happen fast, because you saw the curve is exponential. So the policy has to follow that curve.